very good evening and welcome to Vantage Point here on News First. We're joining you after 2 weeks, and within that 2 weeks we saw Geneva bustling with this resolution that was to be tabled on Sri Lanka on war crimes and systemic crimes that have taken place in the country, and recommendations by the UNHRC on how we can go about resolving these issues in Sri Lanka. Furthermore, we also saw President Maithripala Sirisena addressing the United Nations General Assembly in New York, which drew in a lot of commendation and a lot of applause from the international community for his very philosophical speech, if I must say. And also now we see Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe engaging in a tour of Japan. All this happening in the international arena, with Sri Lanka trying to develop and strengthen its ties with international communities. To discuss all of this, we have a gentleman who has experience in dealing with international communities, and he's none other than former diplomat and political scientist, Dr. Dayan Jayathilaka. Good evening, Doctor, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Mahina. Good to be here.
Well, as I said before, let's start off with the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions that were held in Geneva last week. And exactly a week ago, we saw the UN-sponsored resolution on Sri Lanka being tabled in the UNHRC sessions.
The US resolution.
The US-sponsored resolution. Yeah. So now this resolution was, as many say, was toned down a little bit, but what have you got to say about the tone of this resolution? Many foreign experts, diplomacy experts say that it was toned down from what we saw when Prince Zayed Al Hussein, presented his resolution. You see any difference in the tone of this resolution?
Well, I would prefer to go by the facts rather than commentary. And the resolution that was tabled on the 1st of October, that was adopted on the 1st of October, was no different in any way from the second draft of the resolution that was posted on September 24th. Mm-hmm. So between September 24th and October 1st, that's the last week of negotiations, nothing changed. We do know from the newspapers and from the public record that the Sri Lankan representatives in Geneva, that's Ambassador Arisinghe, our ambassador in Vienna who was brought over, and Ambassador Arisinghe's deputy Samantha Jayasekara, they tried to bring in some amendments. But the newspapers, the Daily FT, the Sunday Times, also reports that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe overrode the Foreign Ministry and our permanent representation in Geneva, and decided that we would go along with the second US draft. So there was no difference between the September 24th US draft and the October 1st resolution. Therefore, if there was any softening, it certainly didn't happen in the crucial last week of negotiations over the text, because we didn't negotiate over the text. I mean, finally, we stopped negotiating and we agreed to adopt it as is.
But the government of Sri Lanka, I mean, initially when we spoke about the first resolution that was tabled at the UNHRC sessions, we spoke about how the government of Sri Lanka said that, it was balanced, that it wasn't as stern or as hard-hitting as they thought it would be. But when the first US draft resolution was brought in, there was a little bit of a stir within the government. They didn't expect it to be so hard-hitting at them. But there were also reports that the US took measures to water it down.
Well, I really don't see where the watering down came in.
For instance, if you take a look at the clauses, there was the hybrid court that was mentioned in the first resolution was not to be seen in the draft resolution that was passed at the UNHRC, and that was something that gave rise to a lot of debate. Instead, the words Commonwealth judges and foreign judges were included. So is that actually a big difference from striking out hybrid court and including Commonwealth judges and foreign?
Well, what does hybrid mean? It means mixed. It means two component. And if you remove the term hybrid and still affirm the need for Commonwealth and foreign judges, defense counsel, dedicated prosecutors and foreign investigators, then you are talking about a hybrid court. To adapt an old joke, which was in fact recycled by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia in the UN General Assembly. He said, if it walks like a terrorist, if it talks like a terrorist, and it squawks like a terrorist, it is a terrorist. So, of course, that's an old joke. If it walks like a duck, if it squawks like a duck, it's a duck. Similarly, if it walks like a hybrid court, if it talks like a hybrid court, if it squawks like a hybrid court, it is a hybrid court. A Sri Lankan judicial mechanism with the inclusion and participation of Commonwealth and foreign judges, prosecutors and investigators, including, and I'm talking about the text of the resolution, says, including in the office of the special counsel, then that's a hybrid mechanism. Simply because you remove the word hybrid, it doesn't mean it's not hybrid. It's hybrid.
Mm-hmm. Now, this resolution, however, appreciates some of the measures that have been taken by the government of Sri Lanka. It has commended its inquiries that it has held. It has commended the LLRC. It has commended the government for taking active measures to have civilian governance in the northern province. So it has commended Sri Lanka, and there is a lot of preambular clauses here that commend Sri Lanka on the work it has done. Is that different from the resolutions that we saw during the previous regime?
Well, certainly it's different. But in these resolutions, Mahina, preambular paragraphs are just that. It's a preamble. And then you have the operative paragraphs, right? And what you look at are the operative paragraphs. So I would say that the preambular paragraphs actually contradict the operative paragraphs here. Because the government is praised in the preambular paragraphs. The measures taken are praised. The road the government is on is praised. And then there's a big contradiction, because if the government is doing so well, and if the sponsors of the resolution really believe that, then they should have said, all right, you have brought in the 19th Amendment to free your institutions, and you are committed to implementing the LLRC and other reports. We will give you the time to see whether you actually do it, unlike the previous government. But instead, what you have in this resolution are things that you never had in the previous resolutions against the previous government, against which the US and the UK had so many nasty things to say. It's tighter now than it was then. You have operative paragraph 6 and operative paragraph 8. I mean, those are the two key paragraphs. Operative paragraph 6 talks about a special court and the office of a special counsel, which the government has promised. So this is something outside of the existing Attorney General's Department and the existing judiciary. And it uses the term should. So the government affirms that the government should set up, as promised, the special court and the office of the special counsel, i.e. the special prosecutor. And then it, in the same paragraph, actually in the same sentence, affirms the need for the participation of Commonwealth and foreign. So there are those who say they don't mention international. Well, what's foreign? Foreign is international. Commonwealth and foreign judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors and investigators in a Sri Lankan judicial mechanism. In that case, it's not a Sri Lankan judicial mechanism. Because if it is...
So you find this contradictory, this entire report, you find this...
Nice things said about the government in the preamble. It doesn't matter who says what in the preamble. What matters is the operative paragraphs. And they don't give the government of Sri Lanka a chance. The government of Sri Lanka could have very well said, look, we've done the 19th Amendment. Our institutions are now independent. We'll do this ourselves. But the sponsors of the resolution do not give the Sri Lankan government the benefit of the doubt. And then there's operative paragraph 8, Mahina, where it says that anybody who is found not guilty, but credibly implicated not by a court of law, but by an independent administrative process of serious violation of human rights during the war, shall not be retained within the Sri Lankan Armed Forces and not recruited into the Sri Lankan Armed Forces.
That was something that was echoed in the previous resolution, which we spoke about
Absolutely.
in our previous show as well.
It was in the earlier text.
Yeah.
So that wasn't watered down. What does it mean? That means that if anybody in the military is not found guilty by a court of law, but is credibly implicated in having violated seriously the human rights of a black tiger, because it doesn't say non-combatant civilians anywhere there, then that person or persons, such persons, will not be kept in the armed forces. They're going to be sacked. So it's a much tougher resolution than we have seen before, though the resolutions of 2013, 2014 and 2012, 2013 and 2014 paved the way for resolution October 2015. There is definitely a continuum.
And it says that the 2015 resolution was based upon the 2012, 2013 and 2014
Which is
resolutions.
True. Absolutely true. So the previous government and its weaknesses were responsible for this. But they are not primarily responsible because there was a way out of this rather than co-sponsoring this very hostile
But some experts
resolution.
are of the view, Doctor, that you see 2012, 2013, 2014, the government of Sri Lanka really disregarded these finger pointings that were done by the Western countries. It didn't have strong ties with the Western countries, and because of these sort of lack in strengthening these ties or giving an ear to what the Western world had to say, these resolutions were hard-hitting. The 2012, 2013, 2014 took a nature of aggressiveness because of the Sri Lankan government's response to the aims and objectives of the Western world. So isn't the 2015 resolution, which is based on these prior three resolutions, taking this space because of the lack of foreign policy and foreign diplomacy that the previous government had?
Did you see Jurassic World?
Yes, I did.
Right. Do you remember the opening, this dinosaur egg, the synthesis, what is that? Indominus Rex, the super dinosaur. So,
that was created in a laboratory.
Right, created in a laboratory. So you had this dinosaur egg in 2014. But the dinosaur came out of the egg only in 2015.
Well, the dinosaur has to come out of the egg.
They could have taken the egg out of the laboratory because it's supposed to be a friendly government. Why allow the egg to hatch? It was the fault of the previous government in its second term, not in its first term, to have lost. It's because of the faults of the previous government that we lost those 3 votes in Geneva. So the dinosaur egg was hatching. But now this is a new government. The Americans should not have allowed the dinosaur to come out of it, and the government of Sri Lanka, the new government, should not have embraced the dinosaur and said, we are going to adopt this as a pet, which is what has happened. Now, note that the resolution does not mention 2009, despite the fact that the government propagandists here say it's because of promises made in 2009 by Mahinda Rajapaksa and Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka that you have a resolution 2015. What, the Americans forgot 2009? No, the Americans are not clowns. They're very serious, very intelligent people. They kept 2009 out. Why? Because there's nothing in 2009 for them. That was a clear, clean win for Sri Lanka. So they referred in paragraph 3 of the October 2015 resolution to 2012, 2013 and 2014, which the government of Sri Lanka lost in Geneva, and lost not because it didn't placate the West or listen to the West, lost because of 2 things. One, it neglected its own allies in the third world. It lost the support of India, it lost the support of Latin America, it lost the unstinted support of the non-aligned movement.
It was billed as a foreign policy debacle at that time.
It was. I mean, when we left in 2009, we had a 2/3 majority, a near 2/3 majority in support of Sri Lanka. In the second term, the government of Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksa administration, depleted that. ran it down, and we kept losing. Now, that was a march of folly. However, what you have in 2015 is the hatching of the dinosaur egg. And out comes the special court, the special counsel's office, which in fact the government of Sri Lanka seems to have promised, and foreign judges, foreign prosecutors, foreign investigators, and the sacking from the Sri Lankan armed forces of anybody implicated credibly by an administrative process of violating the human rights of tigers. Now that is the dinosaur out of the egg.
Now, by co-sponsoring this resolution, is Sri Lanka getting the status of an equal partner where it can decide on, when to implement these recommendations or reducing the imposing of these recommendations?
No, we've agreed to a timeline. See, the problem with the resolution, there are many problems with the resolution, but the main problem is that the resolution is explicitly based on the acceptance of Zaid al-Hussein's report and the promise that the measures contained in that report will be implemented. Now, that report itself is hugely biased. And I say this because Prince Zaid himself, addressing the council on September 30th from New York, says that the Sri Lankan judicial mechanism is incapable, it doesn't have the capacity to deal with the allegations in his report, which have a magnitude and are of an extent that the Sri Lankan courts can't deal with it. In the first place, it's not his place to make a judgment about the Sri Lankan courts. In the second place, what is he really saying? As you know, Mahina, the Sri Lankan courts can deal with any amount of murders, rapes, the worst crimes that you can even think of. There's nothing that we can't deal with. But what he's saying is that these are not individual crimes or some crime by an individual unit. He says, earlier he said these are system crimes. That's within the report. System crimes. So the Sri Lankan state system, the Sri Lankan security apparatus, the Sri Lankan military as a system consciously committed crimes of, and I quote, such magnitude and extent that they can't be handled by the Sri Lankan judiciary. Now that's at the heart of the report. And the report is the very foundation of the US resolution. Why do I say this? Well, I'm not saying it. It's a British permanent representative speaking at the council on the 1st of October after the presentation of the resolution who said this. He said the resolution is firmly founded upon the report of the High Commissioner. Now, I read in some newspaper a very intelligent point that the US resolution, that the spelling is not American spelling. I mean, not that it's wrong, but it's British spelling. So that confirms in me something I've known from, well, 2009, that it's Britain that has been the driving force behind this. So when the British permanent representative says the resolution is firmly founded upon the report of the Office of the High Commissioner and the pledge to implement it, I believe him.
So why co-sponsor?
Why did we co-sponsor this?
Exactly, why I'm asking you, why did we co-sponsor this resolution? Do you think that Sri Lanka felt that it could be an equal partner in this whole investigation?
Mahina, when somebody says that you don't have a judiciary to deal with the magnitude of the crimes that your army has committed, then you're not an equal partner. You're being looked down upon and says, look, you need foreign judges. That's not an equal partnership. It's not equal partnership when somebody wants to put a noose around your neck and you take the noose and you put it around your neck as if it were a garland or a necklace. That's not an equal partnership. If we really wanted to play equal partner, there was a way it could have been done. And I don't mean adversary, I mean equal partner in negotiation.
Is this, as you said in our last show, the tabling of the reports that
by Sir Desmond de Silva? We could have said, look, we need time to read the High Commissioner's report. I mean, look, it's a damning report. We need the time. We're just not going to respond to it now. We have to study it at home. We have to bring it to our parliament. And in the meantime, we have something for you to take a look at. And this is a report of the International Advisory Committee attached to the Maxwell Paranagama.
But there too, Doctor, we have the International Advisory Committee.
Yeah.
So that committee too had international experts. It had even Desmond De Silva, QC, is an international lawyer.
Jeffrey Nice, David Crane.
They all are international experts and with legal backgrounds. So how is that different from what this resolution talks about having Commonwealth and foreign judges and international experts in Sri Lanka's process of dealing with these human rights violations?
Well, there are three differences that come to mind immediately, Mahina. One is the difference between a commission of inquiry and a court. Now, we've had foreign judges, retired judges, in commission of inquiry. President Premadasa had a commission of inquiry into the Denzel Kobekadua death, the death of Denzel Kobekadua, and there were retired Commonwealth judges. But that was a commission of inquiry, didn't have any punitive capability. You can't sentence people. There's a huge difference between a commission and a court. What we're talking about in the resolution is a special court and a special office of a prosecutor. That's very different, chalk and cheese. The second thing is there's a difference between foreign judges and investigators and prosecuting counsel and advisors. Foreign advisors for anything is fine. But foreigners as judges and prosecutors and investigators is crazy. I mean, it's two very different things. I mean, it's the difference between a friend and a husband or wife. I mean, you know. The third thing, Mahina, is that those experts, Desmond De Silva and so on, were for Sri Lanka. You know, it's like the difference between going to a doctor or getting a foreign doctor who's going to help you.
For Sri Lanka, in the sense, Doctor, you're talking about the government of Sri Lanka? For the government of Sri Lanka or Sri Lanka as a whole?
It wasn't for the government of Sri Lanka, because what Sir Desmond and the experts did, and we have seen this in the smaller reports that they issued earlier, or that were prepared earlier, which leaked in the newspapers, and then we know that there's a 500-page report of August 2015. That was nothing to do with the government. That was to do with the war and international law. They went through international law. They went through the international precedents. They took the principles such as proportionality, human shielding, the context of the battlefield, and made the case against the Darusman report, on which, by the way, the Zaid al-Hussein report is based. And it pointed out that the Sri Lankan military did not, as a military, as an institution, wittingly engage in war crimes. That there were isolated incidents, and they have pointed out what those are. And they have come up with a purely domestic process and a roadmap as to how to deal with them. So, it's not about the government of Sri Lanka. It's about the Sri Lankan state. It's about the Sri Lankan military. And it's about Sri Lanka's contemporary history, the war. So that's what it's about. And that was on our behalf. It's different from getting a foreign doctor, we had foreign doctors, to perform an operation which is going to save you, and getting a foreign executioner who's against you, who's already decided that you can't, that your judicial mechanism is not good enough because you've done such horrible wrongs, and that you should sack everybody who's credibly implicated, not found guilty, through an administrative process of having violated the human rights of terrorists.
Well, Doctor, on that note, we'll have to go in for a short commercial break. We'll be back on Vantage Point. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point here on Newsfirst, where we bring you a different perspective to the stories that make the headlines in our country over the past 2 weeks. And joining us in conversation is Dr. Diane Jayatillaka. Now, Doctor, we were speaking about the UNHRC and the US-sponsored resolution on Sri Lanka, which Sri Lanka co-sponsored. Now, despite what you said, and you in one of your articles said that the 1st of October was a day of shame for Sri Lanka. But despite what you say, Doctor, and your against stance for this resolution, there was a lot of hype and a lot of positive response to how the Sri Lankan government dealt with this resolution. We saw when President Maithripala Sirisena arrived in Colombo, the sort of jubilation that was aired on all channels, all broadcasting networks in Sri Lanka. And it was billed as a victory for the country. In what sense of the word is this a victory?
Well, I mean, I don't take that very seriously. I take much more seriously President Sirisena's own good performance in New York. Actually, I'm quite happy with Sri Lanka's performance at the UN General Assembly, and quite unhappy with our performance at the UNHRC in Geneva. So New York was good, Geneva was bad. And President Sirisena, in his speech to the UN General Assembly, did not mention Geneva even once. I thought that was very smart of him. He didn't say, hey guys, good news, we're going to co-sponsor a resolution and we are going to implement this, and thank you Zaida Hussain, you're a real pal. Not a word.
But he did say that we will follow a process of truth-seeking, justice, reparation and non-recurrence, which was also words that were in the resolution.
Geneva. That's nothing about Geneva. He didn't even mention the resolution. He didn't mention that this can be a purely indigenous process, and in fact, the previous government was talking to the South Africans about this. So, it was conspicuous by its absence. Then, President Sirisena gave an interview to the New York Times. And in the New York Times interview, he clearly said that he is not for foreign judges. And he went on to say that any measure will have to be within the Sri Lankan constitution. Now, to me, that was very interesting. And I might even say very positive. It was quite different from what the Prime Minister was saying, which was really very gung-ho about the US resolution, about co-sponsorship, and so on. Now, we read in the newspapers, and I'm really talking about two newspapers which are far from anti-UNP. There's the Sunday Times and the Daily FT, where Darisha Bastian was reporting from Geneva. We read in those two papers that the Sri Lankan permanent representation in Geneva, Ambassador Arisinghe, reinforced by our ambassador to Vienna, and also Ambassador Arisinghe's deputy Samantha Jayasekara, tried to dissent and moved amendments. They were critical of the US draft. But after the September 24th US draft remained unchanged. As I said, no watering down. According to these two newspapers, what happened was that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was very annoyed and he overrode the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry stance. Now, I just cannot understand that, because I think the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry, I've had my differences with the Foreign Ministry and even with the Foreign Minister, Mr. Samravida, but obviously when the Foreign Minister and the Ministry saw the US draft, they were taken aback and they were trying to get the best possible deal that they thought was feasible for Sri Lanka. They were trying to negotiate, but the Prime Minister overrode this. So what I see is some daylight, a gap between the position of President Sirisena, which he took in New York, and in his interview given to the New York Times, and the very enthusiastic position taken by Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, which was so enthusiastic that he overrode the resistance that his own foreign ministry was trying to put up to the US resolution.
Now, you talk about this gap, Dr. Jayatilaka, and it is interesting to note that President Maithripala Sirisena, upon his arrival to the country, has said that the government of Sri Lanka will be deliberating more on this resolution that was adopted, and that he would initiate an all-party conference, a multi-religious conference, to discuss the points that were in this resolution. Now, with this gap in, as you said, the vision of the Prime Minister and the vision of the President, how is this all-party conference or this mechanism going to work? Because there are voices, dissenting voices in the opposition. There are voices of, positive voices from the government. So how is this gap going to be bridged?
Well, if democracy is really observed, I think there won't be a problem. But by democracy, I mean inner party democracy as well. The resolution is so serious, and any attempt to implement it in Sri Lanka is going to be so serious, even more serious than the resolution itself, that every party must have an honest deliberation in its own ranks. And that includes the United National Party. The UNP must have not a rubber stamping of the US resolution, but a full and free discussion within its own ranks at all levels about the resolution.
So
because finally the UNP will have to face the music. So
the all-party conference, in your mind, is something healthy, that is something needed?
Provided it's not just a cork, provided it's a real all-parties conference, where every party has deliberated beforehand within its own councils, where there is no censorship, and every faction is represented. A majority of the SLFP is clearly in the opposition, not with the government.
And where the comments and sentiments of certain individuals or groups are completely overshadowed by...
That should not be the case. That should not be the case. It should be an authentic all-parties conference which allows the free play of all opinions. In other words, it has to be an exercise in political pluralism. Now, if there is such an all-parties conference which deliberates on the resolution and its implications, and perhaps is followed by a parliamentary select committee, then you would have a consensus which can be presented to Parliament and deliberated upon and voted upon. So, our courts have to go through the resolution, our Parliament has to go through the resolution, there is a political process, the resolution has to meet the standards of national consensus. It cannot be imposed by the government. It can't be shoved down the throats of the national body politic.
Because President Maithripala Sirisena does say this is a new experience for our country. We have never seen something like this before. So there is a lot of deliberation that has to be made by all sectors in the country, the judiciary, the parliament, and as you say, even the executive. All have to put their heads together and see how this resolution is going to fit into the Sri Lankan system.
Absolutely, and President Sirisena has a great responsibility because he was elected by the country as a whole, unlike the post of the Prime Minister. So President Sirisena has to take the overall view, the total view. And he's an experienced politician. I think he knows that it's not going to be easy to implement this resolution domestically.
Let's take a step back from the US-sponsored resolution on Sri Lanka. Let's talk about some of the pictures that came out from the United Nations, and specifically from the United Nations General Assembly. Some of the side events that, although are not in a serious light, if you look at it closely, does provide some serious thinking and begs for some serious thinking, because they say pictures speak louder than words. Now, one of the pictures that I saw that was very interesting was this dinner that was hosted by Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, and in the table was President Maithripala Sirisena, there was US President Barack Obama, there was Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, I think there was Russian Vladimir Putin was also there. So some really powerful nations that even are represented in the Security Council in one table with President Maithripala Sirisena. What does those pictures really mean in a diplomatic perspective?
Well, I think that's a very good thing, and that's why I think we could have done much better in Geneva. We could have leveraged the political capital that President Sirisena has now achieved for the country, because he's taken a more moderate line and a more flexible, pragmatic line than his predecessor did in the second half of his second term. And I say second half of the second term because in the first term he did something that none of his predecessors could, which is he kept the international players in such an equilibrium that he was able to get their help and to win the war. But in the second term it was a near disaster internationally. President Sirisena has repaired some of that damage. Unfortunately, Geneva showed that in what is a hybrid government, the UNP component, or rather the prime ministerial component, has swung too far in another direction. So I think President Sirisena did very well. I was very happy to see that photograph. It tells us the real leverage we had, which we did not use in our national interest in Geneva, which is a pity.
Yeah, because there are several countries that could have made it into that table, other than Sri Lanka, a tiny nation.
It's very good that
the Indian Ocean. But
congratulations there to President Sirisena.
But despite President Sirisena's exemplary behavior at the UNGA, and also when he arrived from the airport, we saw him in a shirt that was tucked out, kind of crushed, not something that you would see from a head of state, but he came to New York as an ordinary person.
Well, everyone has their own style.
But his style really worked for him, because there was a lot of applause from the people, from the public, saying, you know, this is definitely a people's president. But then come to the UNGA, and sitting next to him is his son, Daham Sirisena, and he got a lot of flack for that, with charges of nepotism being thrown around, and then Daham Sirisena questioning everybody, asking what is nepotism, and saying that he was invited to the General Assembly. What do these visuals or these kind of reports tell you, Doctor? Is it nepotism, or is it just, can anybody of that nature be invited to the UNGA?
Well, I'm old enough to remember that this stuff started with the Bandaranayakas and Anura Puta being taken around, and the children being introduced to world leaders. And there was criticism then, and that criticism was valid. It continued with President Rajapaksa, where his children, or some of them, were introduced, were taken around and introduced to world leaders. And now it's continuing, unfortunately, with President Sirisena.
So it's an evil that we cannot get rid of.
Every time it gets worse, but it didn't start with President Sirisena, it didn't even start with President Rajapaksa, it started with the Bandaranayakas, it was followed by, because when one does it, then the other thinks, hey, my predecessor did it, if it's good enough for them, why isn't it good enough for my kids?
But President Sirisena did say that, you know, when he was running for elections, he did say that the only reason I left the government and decided to run for president is because I was sick and tired of nepotism. But here we see him,
it's not a good idea,
with his son at the UNGA.
Not a good idea. Too high profile. It's not a good idea at all.
Doctor, now let's move on to Japan, and where Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe is visiting Japan, taking accepting invitation from the Japanese government. Now, Prime Minister speaking in Japan in the Parliament, there were only a few heads of nations who have spoken in Parliament. According to reports that are surfacing, there was Barack Obama, and then there was the Indian Prime Minister, and now there's Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who spoke in the Japanese Parliament yesterday. Now, here he starts off by reminiscing about the time of D.S. Senanayake, about J.R. Jayawardena, how our ties with Japan have been so strong that Japan has helped Sri Lanka economically in several ways. If you look at the parliament that was built by the government of Japan. So Japanese influence in Sri Lanka has been widely regarded. He starts off his speech by quoting D.S. Senanayake, and he says, post-war world should not be dominated by Western powers and USSR. Therefore, he, that is DS Senanayake, did not waver in the belief that it was necessary to encourage Japan to restart its economic development. Isn't this something valid to Sri Lanka right now?
Well, when it comes to foreign policy, we have to remember that the people of Sri Lanka at that time rejected the the UNP's foreign policy of the post-independence years and embraced that of SWRD Bandaranaike. The Sri Lankan people embraced the Bandung Conference of 1955, where the UNP under Sir John Kotolawala was an outlier. One of the reasons for 56 was the sense on the part of the Sri Lankan electorate that there were British bases in Katunayake, that the UNP government, including under great leader DS Senanayake, was far too close to the West and unsympathetic to the newly emergent powers such as China. We established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union only when SWRD Bandaranaike won. So, I think going back to DS Senanayake on foreign policy may not be a very good idea, but it's also symbolic, because I think Mr. Wickremesinghe sees himself as in that tradition. That has never really helped the UNP in national politics, and that is the strong point of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. Now, that having been said...
But doesn't that kind of echo the situation Sri Lanka is in now? Look at our economic condition. The rupee is depreciating at an alarming rate. Our stock market isn't performing well. We're really in a financial crisis, although we don't want to admit it. So...
Which is funny, because usually when the UNP comes in, it does better than the SLFP. But this time, the UNP has done much worse than President Rajapaksa did with the economy.
So doesn't these words of DS Senanayake, which are echoed by Ranil Wickremesinghe, also something that resonates the situation now, that we shouldn't, post-war world, Sri Lanka is a post-war country, should not be dominated by Western powers? And
yeah, but he says Western powers, and what he's quoting is DS Senanayake and later Sir John, who said that it shouldn't be dominated by the West or the East, and actually linked up with the West. I think that our situation is very different from that of DS Senanayake, because Sri Lanka was a very prosperous country under DS Senanayake. We had enormous foreign exchange reserves. We were doing very well. We benefited from the so-called Korean boom, the Korean War boom. Now we are in real trouble. So I sincerely hope that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe will succeed in his effort to get Japanese investment and economic assistance from Japan, because we need it. We need it because of the mismanagement which has seen the rupee plummet. And the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce has issued a statement which is a very strong statement against some of the policies of the new UNP government, especially on taxation. Mm-hmm. So that's really significant, and we are heading for a serious economic crisis. It's not the time to establish special courts and special councils and bring in foreign judges and change the constitution so as to deal with the TNA's grievances, because the economy is in some kind of downswing. You try to do all of that at the same time, it's a recipe for instability, to say the least.
Well, it's time to take another short commercial break. We'll be right back. You're watching Vantage Point. Welcome back. In conversation with Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka, former diplomat and political scientist, we've covered the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions in Geneva, the US sponsored resolution on Sri Lanka, which incidentally Sri Lanka co-sponsored. And we are now talking about Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit to Japan. We spoke about some of the opening statements he made, Doctor, during his address in Parliament. Now, another interesting point that he raised was about the national machinery when it comes to reconciliation. And he said that there are three mechanisms that will be used. One is a truth commission to investigate on violence. The other one would be a very innovative new mechanism which he calls the Compassionate Council, that is going to be made up of clergy of all major religions in Sri Lanka, that would deal with individual cases, and a judicial structure for human rights. What do you make up of these three mechanisms that the Prime Minister has spoken about in Japan?
Well, it's like a baby trying to make a structure with blocks, and the blocks don't kind of fit. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
which he does touch upon.
Yes,
in his
yes,
address.
it is very explicit. It's in the resolution as well. Did not have a criminal justice or punitive court. That was the whole thing about South Africa. Truth and reconciliation. You come over there, you tell the truth in public, you ask for forgiveness from your victim or the victim's family if the victim is dead. The punishment is really that society knows what you've done, and then you go, having obtained forgiveness. Now here, the third tier of the structure contradicts the first tier. The first tier is truth and reconciliation, non-recurrence, etc., etc. The second tier is the Compassionate Council. Whether the Compassionate Council is going to continue with the FCID investigations, I don't know, but still it's going to be compassionate, right? So you've got the Compassionate Council. And then the third one is the judicial mechanism, which is completely contradictory to the South African experiment. Because it's a punitive mechanism, the resolution says so. You have your special court, you have your special prosecutor, you try these people under national and international law, as the case may be. Then you have your administrative procedures, which are not judicial, where you sack everybody who may be credibly implicated of human rights violations of terrorists. Now, how does that square with the top? That is the South African Truth and Reconciliation, which is a cathartic healing model. It's all wrong. It doesn't fit. There's no single logic. There's no coherence that runs through this structure.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's now move on to global incidents, and there has been a lot of debate about the airstrikes that have been carried out by Russia on ISIS targets in Syria. The Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, coming under a lot of pressure by now Turkey even, saying that, that what he is doing or what Russia is doing is not the correct thing. But then we take a look at the US, and we see the US having bombed a hospital in Afghanistan, thinking that it was a terrorist occupied location. But once they found out it was a hospital, they say it's collateral damage. So isn't this ironic, Dr. Jayatilaka, that when Russia is trying to, have airstrikes against ISIS targets, which are terrorist organizations, they come under a lot of scrutiny from the US and from other nations. But when it's the US, they can get away by saying collateral damage.
Well, when the US bombs a hospital and kills 19, including doctors, it's collateral damage. When the Sri Lankans, who don't have the technology that the US does, may or may not have done it, then it's a system crime which requires a special court and foreign judges. And it requires the sacking, the non-retention from within the armed forces of anybody who may be credibly implicated with such a crime. So that's rank hypocrisy. Now, at the UN General Assembly, you saw two outstanding leaders presenting two visions of the world. I mean, there are things I like and respect about them both. Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin. I wish we had somebody who would combine the strengths of both, but we don't.
Hybrid.
Yeah, hybrid. Very good. Brilliant. Brilliant. We don't. So instead, you have to take your pick. And I think that President Putin uttered some home truths. He said, look, where did ISIS come from? ISIS came because the West invaded Iraq and Libya and kept arming insurgents against Syria. And that broke up states, that created the gap which was filled by these extremist elements. And he said, have you still learnt your lesson? Are you willing to say that you were wrong? I don't think so. Now, President Obama said ISIS is bad, but Assad is also bad, and we are not going to just fight ISIS and allow Assad to stay on. Maybe he can stay for a couple of months as a transitional leader. Putin says there are legitimate governments in the world, and when they are fighting terrorists, we are with those legitimate governments, and we are against the terrorists. Now, the Americans bomb ISIS targets. The Turkish Air Force bombs ISIS targets. Then what's wrong with Russia bombing ISIS targets? That's because there's something else going on.
What's happening under the table?
The West is bombing ISIS targets perhaps as a prelude to supporting its so-called moderate terrorists and toppling Assad. Russia isn't going to fall for that anymore. So you have Russia supported by Iran, supported by the Hezbollah from Lebanon, which is defending Assad and attacking the terrorists. So these are two different views, and strangely, Geneva is also the playing out of that story, Mahina, because Sri Lanka was a legitimate government which had to fight terrorism. We would have been like Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria if not for the fact that we defeated the Tigers.
On our own terms.
Yes. And we did have to use force, including airstrikes for that. Now, the West wants to punish the government that did it, while it says it's opposed to terrorism. The Russians and the Chinese spoke for us on September 30th and October 1st in Geneva. Even though we were for the resolution, they did whatever they could. The Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Vietnamese. And their point was this was a fight against terrorism. Don't penalize this government. Don't penalize the Sri Lankan state. Now, that is the struggle that's taking place in the world. And the Russians have decided that they're not going to be a pushover anymore.
It's a manipulative game, isn't it, Dr. Jayatilaka? I mean, terrorism, diplomacy, it all falls to who can manipulate the best.
There's a lot
who
of
can pull the
hypocrisy.
strings the best. And in more ways than one, unlike countries like Russia, you submit. There's always a dominant and a submissive. So you always submit to the dominant forces.
Well, not always. Look at the Cubans. I mean, this is the lesson that Mahinda Rajapaksa's administration didn't learn. And certainly the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration has no intention of learning. Cuba showed that you can be a small and relatively poor country. Relatively small and relatively poor. It's bigger in size than Sri Lanka, smaller population. But that you can stand up to the West and negotiate a deal which maintains your core national interests and your dignity. You can negotiate a deal as equals. You can even beat the United States in the UN if you have a first-class foreign policy, first-class diplomacy, and if your spine is straight.
And because of that, there are lots of other countries who would join you in that fight.
They will,
if you look at Cuba, you have Venezuela, you have Bolivia, all have stood in that same sort of thinking. We are not going to let anybody dictate terms, especially the US.
Absolutely. Now, therefore, it's not inevitable that you submit. It's not inevitable at all. Assad is certainly not going to submit, and the Russians and the Iranians are not going to allow the West to do to Assad what they did to Milosevic, what they did to Gaddafi, and what they did to Saddam Hussein. Of the two leaders who spoke, while I admire Barack Obama, I've always been a fan of his, I think there was much less hypocrisy in what Vladimir Putin said. And Putin spoke straight from the shoulder, and he got one heck of an ovation. I think he spoke for most of us in the third world. So those are the two competing world visions that unfortunately we have to choose between, and do not seem to be able to come up with a hybrid of.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dayan Jayatillak, for joining us on the show on Vantage Point today. With that, we conclude today's edition of Vantage Point. We'll meet you in a fortnight. Let's see what happens, the future of this resolution, how it's going to fold out, how Sri Lanka is going to get this US-sponsored resolution, its recommendations into its national system. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.